Hello, welcome to Science with Mrs. Blackburn. I'm here to do a quick video review with you for your test on ecology. So we are going to just review everything that we've talked about for the past few weeks, just very quickly to make sure that we understand everything for our upcoming test. So, first of all, our topic is ecology, so it's good for us to know what the word ecology actually means. So ecology is just going to be the study of how living things interact with each other and their environment. Now, very simple. The first thing that we need to really look at when we consider this definition of ecology is the fact that living things are not only interacting with other living things, but also their environment. And this brings us into two really important things that we have discussed when we talk about ecosystems, and that is biotic factors So biotic factors are just the living things in an environment, within an ecosystem, okay? So these biotic factors could be things like plants, okay? Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, tiny single-celled things like protists. We talked about things like phytoplankton in class, and those are going to be little tiny photosynthetic organisms. And even when we consider biotic factors, we have to look at dead organisms, things that used to be alive. So this actually includes once living material. So those are our biotic factors. Notice the word bio. The word bio means living. Anytime you see bio in front of anything, it has to do with something that's alive. So the study of biology is the study of living things. And that's actually what we're doing with ecology. That's a branch of biology. So these would be our biotic factors that are in an ecosystem. Now, look at the other part of this definition. Their environment. So an environment, of course, is going to be non-living, and it's going to have parts of it that are not alive. We call the things in an environment that are not alive those abiotic factors. And anytime you put an A in front of another word part, usually that means not, okay? So not living factors, abiotic factors. These types of factors include things like sunlight, which is going to be very important, and we'll see here in a minute. Soil, obviously not alive. Water, and air. And this could even be things like temperature, pH, which is acidity. When we look at things like a pond or a marine ecosystem, that's going to be something very important. So anything that is alive in an ecosystem will be considered a biotic factor. Anything not alive will be an abiotic factor. And again, the study of ecology is for us to really look at how living things are going to react with those biotic factors and the abiotic factors. So everything is all connected. So that is really what we're going to be studying. And we've got to keep both living and non-living things in mind as we go along. So the first thing that we really do need to know after we talk about this is the organization of an ecosystem. So when I look at an ecosystem, that's the most important part of studying ecology, is kind of knowing what we're looking at and how it's organized. So an ecosystem is going to include all living and non-living parts of an area at a certain time. And that's how I want us to really think about it. It's all the living and non-living parts of an area at a certain time. So when I'm looking at an ecosystem, I could be talking about one anywhere. I could be talking about a pond. So a pond ecosystem, here's my example. A pond ecosystem might include something like frogs. It might include, of course, water, maybe mud, rocks, maybe some goldfish, maybe some flies, ducks, etc. It's all living and non-living things there. So notice I have my living things, frogs, goldfish, flies, ducks, all of that, and my non-living things, which would be my water, mud, rocks, all living and non-living things. Or in other words, as we've learned so far, it's going to include biotic and abiotic factors, okay? Both things. Now, in an ecosystem, we have another level of organization, okay? So within an ecosystem, we have things called communities. Okay, so one would be ecosystem. Two, we need to talk about communities. Communities just include all the living populations in an ecosystem. So if I'm looking at communities within an ecosystem, and we'll use our pond ecosystem as my example, my community would include the frogs, the goldfish, the flies, and the ducks. So that would be my living community. My ecological community would include all the living things. And now we have kind of a third tier down, a third section, and we call those populations. Okay? Populations are going to basically be all the members of a specific species in an ecosystem at a time. Okay, those are all the members of a specific species in an ecosystem. So in this case, I might just say the pond has a population of ducks. Okay, the duck population would include all of the ducks, all the same species, and that ecosystem at a certain time. Now, I might have another species of ducks, or the same species of ducks, forgive me, that are somewhere else in a different ecosystem, okay? So I might have mallard ducks in this pond ecosystem, but then all the way across the United States there might be some mallard ducks, same species, but they wouldn't be considered part of this duck population. So this is kind of like a hierarchy, or kind of like some levels of organization here. So I'm going to turn my page over just to show us how this little hierarchy works. So you have an ecosystem, which is going to include communities, which include populations, which will include a particular species, and within that species you have individual organisms. So this is kind of how the hierarchy works. Now, in an ecosystem, remember we talked about the fact that we have living things and non-living things in an ecosystem. Those living things, we call that the ecological communities. All those biotic factors will work together and interact with each other in a lot of different ways, okay? So the next thing that we really need to discuss is the fact that ecosystems are very dynamic. That means that they aren't just there, they're going to change in a lot of different ways. So the first way that we need to think about how they change is with their populations. These numbers of different species, these numbers of different individuals are going to change over time for different reasons, okay? So I'll write that to the side. Can change in numbers over time. Now, what are some things that can cause populations to change? Well, lots of different things can cause populations to change. We can have disasters, natural disasters like maybe a volcano, depending on where you are, maybe a hurricane, maybe a forest fire, anything like that. Or it can even be an invasive species. It could be something like over hunting or overfishing. Okay, lots of different things will determine the population numbers in a community within an ecosystem. So that is something that we need to be able to determine. One way that scientists can look to see certain trends about what happens is they can look at a population graph. And just the most simple way I could do this is we can look at a population over time. So let's go back to the duck population that we talked about in our fake ecosystem for just a minute. If I were to look at a population graph of ducks, and let's say my population graph showed something like, let's say here's my population, and then down here. So let's say this is my time, and this is over maybe 5 months. We're watching this duck population. And I were to sit here and think, well, at what point, well, first of all, what trends do I see? The very obvious trend here is our population starts to dip right there. Okay, it seems pretty steady. That duck population is doing good, have a good number of ducks, and then they start decreasing. So if I were to expect something to have happened, it would be right here around the 3-month mark. If each of these little time marks means 1 month. So if I were asked a question on a test, or even if I were a scientist and I were to look at graphs like this, I'm going to really pay attention to right here, okay, when that population went down. What could have happened here? It could have been that there was a drought and there wasn't enough water and there wasn't enough food supply for the ducks. There could have been some sort of disaster. There could have been a big duck hunting craze that year or that month, who knows, but that would be where I would look. So a population time graph is something that we looked at in class that we need to really be aware of and be able to analyze. So we've talked about populations, we've talked about communities within ecosystems, and now we need to talk about a little bit more of those interactions. Ecosystem interactions. An ecosystem is going to be, like I said before, very dynamic, which means that all of the different species, all of the biotic factors and abiotic factors are going to interact with each other in certain ways. Nothing is left all by itself. Everything will have an effect on everything else within that ecosystem. And one of the biggest ways we can see that, and we can see examples of that, is with energy flow in an ecosystem. So basically, in order to do anything, in order to make any sort of change, living things have to obtain energy. They have to get energy. So living things get energy by eating and being eaten. That's something I'm going to write down because that's really important. They get energy by eating and being eaten. So energy does flow through the living things of an ecosystem. Now we have a few ways that we can show the energy flow in an ecosystem. We can show that in three different ways. The first way is by making a diagram of a food chain. The food chain is just going to be the most simple diagram of energy flow. It's going to be what shows us exactly where the energy goes and what's happening to it. So the first part of a food chain has to have the origin of the energy, where the energy has come from. So we know that all energy on Earth, no matter how we trace it, is going to have come from the sun. Okay? All energy comes from the sun. That's the source of energy. Now, in order for us as people and the animals around us to get to that energy, we have to eat a plant, or we have to eat something else that has eaten a plant, because plants do something awesome for us. It's called photosynthesis, and they are able to get the energy from the sun to make their own food. That food's called glucose, and it is going to basically harness that energy from the sun in a way that we can use. If I want energy, I can't just go lay out in the sun and say, oh, I'm good. Now I'm going to want to drive around and get me a Big Mac or something. That's not that healthy, but it would give me some energy. So anyway, we have this process called photosynthesis, which is going to be how we get energy from the sun through plants. So you're going to have a plant, which would be a producer. Okay, that's going to be a plant. I'm going to just draw me a little plant. Okay, so a food chain will start with a producer. A lot of times you don't see the sun in a diagram of a food chain if you're reading about it or on a test or anything else. A lot of times it's assumed that we know that that's where that plant got the energy. But I wanted to talk about that because this is so very important to your science education. So photosynthesis gives producers or plants their own food. We call them producers because they make their own food. All right, so in a food chain, we start with the producers, whatever has made its food, and then we're going to show the energy flow from that producer to one organism that eats it, okay? We call that a consumer, okay? We actually call it a primary consumer because it is getting the primary energy from that plant. It's going to be the first one to have eaten that energy that the plant harnessed from the sun through photosynthesis. So in this little food chain I'm drawing, I'm thinking of something that's going to eat that plant, okay? And let's say that it's going to be a little rabbit. I'm going to draw me a little rabbit. So there's my little rabbit that ate that plant, okay? He is my primary consumer. All right, so the plant's energy now goes to the rabbit. Now notice the direction of the arrow. When we draw or analyze a food chain, we notice that the arrow is pointing to the mouth of the consumer. It's going in the direction of energy flow. So this represents the fact that the energy went from the plant and now some of it went to our rabbit here. Okay, now that rabbit unfortunately is not the end of this food chain. There's going to be something else that eats this rabbit. Let's say that there is a snake population and they love to eat rabbits. There's my little snake. And so here's my snake population, and my snake is the next step on the food chain, and we're going to call him. Also, he's a consumer. And notice the word consumer, it has to consume something else to get energy. It can't produce its own food. It cannot do photosynthesis. That's why it's called a consumer. So this consumer is going to be called a secondary consumer. because he is the second one in line for that energy. Okay? Now, next one. Let's say that we also have a hawk population in this area. And I'm going to try my best to draw a little hawk. There he is. Not the best hawk I've ever drawn in my life, but he'll do. And let's say that this hawk eats snakes. That is one scary looking hawk. Kind of looks like a penguin, but we'll do it. So this hawk, okay, the energy is going to go from the rabbit to the snake and from the snake to the hawk because the hawk's going to eat that snake. We call him also a consumer, but we'll call him a tertiary consumer because he's the next one, the third in line for that energy. Now, that being said, this can go on and on and on and on. And we call each of these levels within this food chain a trophic level. All of these are considered trophic levels. And we have done some things in class where you've had to kind of analyze a food web or a food chain to see how far it goes, and we've gone all the way up to 6. And so this can keep going on and on and on and on. And in some ocean ecosystems, some marine ecosystems, you can see it go way, way up the trophic levels. So usually on land ecosystems, we don't really go past tertiary, or quaternary would be the next one. But this is just an example of how that energy flows in a straight line. Now, in real life, we know that it's not as simple as this. We talk about that in class all the time. It's not really this simple because in real life, this snake might eat more than rabbits, okay? The snake might also eat, I don't know, mice. Oh no. So he also might eat mice. Or the hawk might also eat rabbits as well. So if you notice, my food web is getting way more complicated. Maybe this little mouse eats that same plant, okay? So when it gets more complicated, that is called a food web. And this will show multiple food chains in an ecosystem. Okay? And this is more like what it is in real life. A food web is more representative of what we really see in real life, because in real life, a hawk is not only going to eat a snake. It might eat snakes and rabbits and frogs and little tiny foxes, as sad as that might be. We're going to have multiple food sources there. And so a food web shows all of that energy flow throughout an ecosystem. So a food web is the second way that we can show how energy flows through an ecosystem. Now, probably my favorite way to show energy flow is the third way, because it really gets into numbers, and we know that we like math and science together. So this would be an energy pyramid. And I love this visual because it really gives us an idea of what is happening to the amounts of energy in an ecosystem. So first of all, in our energy pyramid, we think of what, first of all, we look at the shape that we have. We have this triangular shape, and that represents that something here at the bottom is going to have a lot. Something up here at the top is not going to have as much. And the thing that we're really analyzing here is the energy. So whatever's down here will have the most energy. Whatever's up here will have the least. Now, we're going to start at the bottom of our pyramid. And remember, all energy from Earth comes from the sun. So I drew a little sun there. And so in my first level of my pyramid, I know that the thing closest to the sun, maybe not really as far as distance goes, but in connections biologically, is going to be my producers. They are going to have the most energy in an ecosystem because they are getting it directly from the sun through that process of photosynthesis. Now, the next level up what eats a producer? That would be a primary consumer. Notice that these are all things that we talked about on this page. We are really looking at the same concepts in a different way. And this is important for you to know as you study for your test, because it's really not that difficult. We're talking about the same things over and over. We're just talking about them in a different way and for different purposes. This shows the direction of energy flow. This is going to be talking about the amount of energy that's making it up each trophic level. So again, producers give the energy to the primary consumer. The secondary consumer is going to eat the primary consumer. And then over here, I'll actually do 4 levels this time. The tertiary will eat the secondary, and then I have the quaternary. Can't see that very well. I ran out of room. But that's quaternary consumer. But the point is that down here at the bottom, we see that the producers are going to have the most energy. So if I'm tracking the amount of energy that's going to be able to make it through each level, it's going to be high down here at the bottom and lower up here at the top. Now, the reason why it's hard to think, just one little tip here, the reason why it's hard to think of a quaternary consumer example is because also the populations of each of these get lower as you go up the pyramid, okay? So if this was energy and this was population, both things are going to get lower as we go up this ecosystem. Now, this makes a lot of sense because if you were to look out your window, what are you going to see the most of? You're going to see a whole lot of plants out there. You're going to see way more plants than you see animals. Now, you'll see more primary consumers. You might see more little bugs that eat plants, or even birds that are herbivores, okay, that eat plants. Then you're going to see secondary consumers. You're not going to see as many maybe foxes or wolves, okay? And you're going to see way fewer hawks or things that eat those secondary consumers. So that being said, this actually does make a whole lot of sense, and I like this representation probably the best for that reason, because it shows that the energy down here at the bottom is higher and the populations will be higher, and as we go up each trophic level, our energy level and our population is going to go down. Now here's the interesting thing. All of this is about energy flow. Only 10% of the energy from a previous level makes it to the next trophic level. So let's say I start out with 10,000 kilocalories of energy in my producer level. Kilocalories, don't panic, that's just a unit to measure energy. By the way, if you look at a food label, you see calories. That shows you how much energy is in that food. So let's say that we start out with 10,000 kilocalories of energy in our producers. Only 10% of that is going to make it to the next level, to the primary consumer. So only 1,000 kilocalories will make it up from there. And then from that 1,000, you're only going to have 100. And then from there, you're only going to have 10. And then over here, you're only going to have 1. Okay? So the energy really is diminished as we go up these levels. Okay? Now, where does it go? The law of conservation of energy tells us that energy, just like matter, can't be created or destroyed. So it's not disappearing forever. It's just being, finger quote, lost as heat, or it's being undigested by the other trophic levels. Okay? So if a rabbit is eating a carrot, it's not going to digest 100% of that carrot. It's not going to get all of that energy. So some of that energy is going to just stay in that rabbit, okay? And it will eventually be decomposed by our decomposers like our bacteria and our fungi. But as far as making it up those trophic levels, that's not going to happen. So this is a really good way of showing how energy flows in an ecosystem. Now, there's a lot more that we can learn about ecology. These are the very basics. These things kind of help us with the idea of how living things interact with one another. The big takeaway from this unit that we learned in class is that all living things are connected. They're even connected to non-living things, so any changes that humans make to an ecosystem does have effects and does have a consequence. And so it's important that we understand how living things work together, because we are living and we are in an ecosystem, and we do play a part. And it's important that we make sure that we know where we are and we take care of our environment, because of course we live in it. So this has been our first little review for our test with ecology, and study hard.